Hi, my name is Yann. I'm an oil-based painter here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm here to walk you through the steps on how to make your very own self-portrait using Arteza oil paints, like this.
We're going to start with breaking down the process into smaller steps. So I got a couple of small sketches called thumbnails that we're going to use to plan our painting before we even get to getting this on a final canvas. So first, we're going to tone the canvas with a solid color, and then we're going to do a sketch in paint called the underpainting. And then from there, we will be color blocking, which means just laying out the basic colors and shapes of the image before we clean it up. And all of this will be using our reference as a guideline. So let's go on to step one. All right, first we've got our canvas, and this is a pre-gessoed canvas, which just means that it's got a layer of acrylic paint already on there and it is ready to use, and the oil paint will not seep through it too much. Next, we have our set of brushes. We have these Arteza ones. Just pick the ones that you like at different sizes. And then we have our Arteza premium oil paints, which we'll be using. We've got the box set of 24 pieces. Finally, we have our mineral spirits in this jar, which mineral spirits are they're like water for acrylic paint, which you use to dilute the paint and clean your brushes off with. All right, we're going to go ahead and tone the canvas so it's all one solid color. And usually it's good to pick a more neutral tone because for portraits, it's good to have a warm tone because it helps have the skin have a warm glow in the end for the final product. And another thing with toning the canvas is once you paint on top of that, any spaces where you don't fully cover it with paint on top, that color that's underneath is going to poke through and just add a little bit of vibrancy to your painting. So we've got our paint laid out, and then we're going to take our brush. Let's use a big brush. We're going to dip it in our mineral spirits, and then we're going to mix that into the paint until it is pretty runny, just so that it's loose enough that we can cover the entire canvas and then wipe it down to create a pretty even tone. And it is so okay to be messy at this part just because we're going to be wiping it away and also painting on top. So the main point is just to cover the entire canvas and get the paint pretty thin just as a starting point. So you can see how liquid this paint is right now. And then also just be mindful because it will splash a little if you use a lot of mineral spirits. Really works to thin that paint out. So now that we've got our canvas colored, it's pretty intense. What we're going to do is grab a sheet of paper towel or even cloth. I know I used to cut up t-shirts back in college for this, and we're just going to even out the tone. Take away some of that paint just so it's a little bit more neutral and a little bit even all throughout. And that gives us a good starting point for our paintings. All right, now that our canvas is toned, we're going to get started on the underpainting. I've got my reference image right here that I'm working off of, and then we're just going to get into some, I guess, drawn. It's technically painting, but really we're going to keep it very, very loose and focus on those really big shapes. So let's see. We're going to start with the head and placing that where we want it to be. Let's see. We've got the ear. Head goes into the neck. We're going to add this color right here. And then one thing that's great about underpainting with paint that is pretty loose with mineral spirits is that it's pretty easy to wipe off if you feel like you've made a mistake or you want to give a shape another try. It's a great time to kind of rework your painting as you're doing it. Let's see, and kind of make sure that everything is where you want it to be. For example, let's say I actually didn't like where this ear was. I can give it a quick wipe and place it back down. And because we haven't done too much work on the actual painting, we are not afraid to erase and try again. See, and we are just blocking in very general loose shapes so everything feels right. And then as we develop the painting, we'll get more and more accurate and more detailed. So we're going to do a loose shape for the nose here. On with the nose should maybe be a little smaller and higher. We're going to erase this and give it another shot. And it is very good to not be afraid to rework things at this stage. But I think it also helps to keep things loose because we will have plenty of time. We will have plenty of time to tighten up the drawing and painting as we go. And we'll definitely get there. So let's get our color palette set up and move on to the next and most exciting step. So obviously starting off with the basics of white and black, I'm going to go into our more neutral tones, get some burnt umber, some burnt sienna, and some yellow ochre. And these are pretty good browns that are kind of like different levels of warmness or proximity to yellow that we'll probably end up using a lot for skin tones. Now that we've got our paints set up, I have my palette knife for mixing. Yeah, we'll get started on color blocking, which is just like getting the essential colors down. So we want to start with some basic colors first, just to make sure that we have something to work off of as we get more and more complex with the painting. And then one thing to consider as well is as we're doing color blocking can be at multiple levels of detail. So we can keep it really loose and do a single color like this, or we can start thinking about, oh, we're doing green, let's have a light green and a dark green, and we'll place those, and that'll help us get maybe a little bit further on our way before we start developing details. But for right now, I will stick to this green as we work through this, and then we can continue adding even more variations of this green and other colors as well to the canvas. I'm going to go ahead and switch now. I think that'll get us covered a little bit quick. It's fine to move quick in this stage. It's just like the underpainting. We're keeping it very loose just to make sure we get stuff down and covered. And then we will tighten it up as much as we need to going forward. And it's looking pretty good in terms of the spacing where everything is. And there's no more green in our painting, so we can move on to adding a different color. And let's get into the skin tone. So let's start with this and see how we feel about this shade. And then I'm going to start on my forehead just because that's like a very clear spot in the reference where it's like mostly a solid color. And I think this paint is a little warmer than we want to do for all of the skin tone, but there are warm areas on my face that I think we can go ahead and add this to, and then we can adjust as we go. Let's see, right by the nose, it's a little warm spot. And then we'll get some under the chin as well. So just thinking about while you're mixing paints, we're going to end up mixing a lot of different paints. So if you have a color that you like but don't necessarily want to use for everything, you can still find different places to use them. Just be mindful of where, like, what are the colors that you're seeing in the image, and what are different ways that you can use the paints that you already have mixed creatively to get the effect that you want. So I'm wiping off this brush on my paper towel. I'm going to wipe it off again in the mineral spirits. And then we're going to get some of this darker paint and start filling in some darker areas. And then we're moving pretty slowly because we will have time to kind of build up the image as we go and test different colors as we are finding them and mixing them into paint. But just remember, we are primarily color blocking. So we're just trying to lay things down to get a basic sense of where we want everything to go as we're building the image. And you can see this paint is considerably darker. So I'm going to use it for the spots that have very apparent shadows or have hair, where we're going to have a lot of dark paint that will need to contrast pretty strongly. So we'll get the nostrils in there. And then I think I'll block out the eyes. So the eyes tend to take a lot of refining just because we are so attuned to looking at eyes. We know exactly, like we can instinctively tell when eyes are a little bit off, which means they have to be very accurate in a painting or else they'll read as incorrect pretty quickly. We'll start with these basic shapes and then we'll tighten it up as we get further and further. I think we'll start with this though for the hair, though I think we will need to get even darker for the hair as well. And as you're color blocking, it's a good time to also reassess what the decisions that you've made in the sketching phase and the underpainting phase, and see if there's anything that needs to move around a little bit. One thing that I like about oil paint is it's obviously very, very fluid. The paint stays wet for a long time, so you're continually adjusting it. At least for me, it's adjustment until the very, very end of the painting. So don't be afraid to move things around if you are seeing that they're off as you're working. You'll probably see this face look way different like from now to the end. It'll just be very, very separate. And that just comes from you're working the image, you're finding it in a lot of ways, and you're building it up to kind of be what you want it to be. And that can take a little bit of trial and error, especially if you, depending on how much time you devote to planning your image, or even if you plan your image at all. Some people just go straight into it. All right, so we've got some dark values down. I think let's try and find that neutral tone for the face. So right now, this brown that we have here is still reading pretty dark. And we have the even darker brown for the hair and for the shadows on the face. I think we can find something that's maybe a little bit more neutral and yellowish just for these areas that aren't necessarily highlights, but we'll have our highlights on top of them. So let's go back to mixing. I'm going to clear off my palette knife and then start looking at some colors. So now that we know what these are like on the palette, we can start with these and mixing them. We're starting off with a base that is similar to kind of the medium between these two. And I think we can go lighter. So I mentioned going lighter and then a little bit more yellow. I tend to default to yellow ochre because that's a more natural color than straight yellow, but it's always good if you're trying to get more yellow to just add yellow. I think yellow is kind of like white, where it takes a lot to really, really change the color. So I think it's fine to play with adding more and more yellows to get warmer tones without necessarily darkening the color of your paint or washing it out with white. So that's a little bit more neutral, but I think we can get lighter just to distinguish these colors from each other. And I think in this beginning stage, it's important to have clarity between the dark, light, and middle values of your paint, just so that it's easier to find your way as you're adjusting your colors. And then the whole process from there, color blocking really moves directly into blending and finishing up an image, and you're just going back and forth between filling up large spaces and then narrowing things down to a little bit more and more detailed as you go. So it really is just this kind of back and forth process for the entire time, and kind of minutely adjusting details as you go. Like right now I'm adding a little bit of orange, and You see I'm mixing with my brush like I had mentioned before. Just doing different things to get to where image is in the picture. So I like this. Let's keep going. Yeah, it's a lot of back and forth in terms of finding colors that work, laying them on, seeing how they fit with the other colors, and then adjusting, and then doing more of that, and then adjusting, and then doing more of that, and then adjusting. I think that's why a lot of people, when they talk about painting, especially oil painting, they say it's a lot about finding the image because you're like kind of carving it out of what you've got laid out already on the canvas, working that into something that is a little bit more complex, just a little bit at a time. In the middle of what? Oh yeah. And then just making sure I still keep my big shapes in mind as I'm placing things down. I think we have a loose sketch, but we want to be mindful that we're keeping things where we want them and originally intended them to be. All right. Now that we've got some basic colors laid out, it just comes down to everything. All the colors that we're laying out from here on out are kind of relative to what we already have laid down. So I think this is the spot where your reference is still a good tool, but you want to really be looking at what is going on inside the painting itself and making sure that it's cohesive. Try some yellow ochre or some yellowish tones. All right. I feel like we've made some good progress in the skin tones. Even though it's not super clear, it will come together. And I've got like some shades that I think are working for me. So I'm going to move these up on my palette so they are a little bit out of the way. And then I'm going to get back into this grain for the shirt. I think there's a little bit more work that we can do there. Especially adding some shadows. Let's start with the green, get a little bit of blue, and a little bit of blue goes a really long way. Some burnt umber to keep it a little darker and neutral, and then we'll see what that gives us. So even this, I think, is still a bit rich. And then I'm mixing some extra colors from my palette just to make sure no paint goes to waste. And usually the more paint that you mix, especially if they're opposite of each other on a color wheel, they'll kind of cancel each other out and get a little bit more grayish, which is I think what we want because the shirt is not super vibrant. And honestly, it's probably better to test it out instead of just keep mixing into infinity. Let's see if our thinking panned out and we have a color that works well. See, this might be a little too dark for some of those flatter areas on the shirt, but I think we can definitely use it for the shading under the collar or any wrinkles. So I'm actually going to wipe this off a little bit with our paper towel, just to clear off a little bit, and then we'll see where we can place this color. We're finding a new one. That I think will blend a little bit nicer with the green we already have. So let's maybe brighten this up with a little bit of green, and then I'll grab some yellow. Go ahead, pale yellow. So we'll tap some yellow pale. Bring this back to a lighter place. It's pretty bluish as is. Okay, there's one right here on my shirt, and the shadow kind of extends out. And then on to blend into this. And then actually like some of these folds are really kind of loose and abstract. I feel like that can be really fun, especially on clothing, to leave things pretty loose, not getting too into the nitty gritty details of them. I think that's also what's fun about painting in oil. You can leave things loose. It just has that painterly effect. All right, let's see if we can get back to some of that middle value grain. Add a little bit of yellow and then a little bit of white. And then that'll put us on a good spot to get back working on those skin tones. There's a lot of back and forth. As you're developing one part of the painting, you want to make sure you're also looking back at the other parts. Make sure everything is balanced, or at least where you want it to be, so that by the end, you're kind of wrapping everything up at the same time. To clean up the brush, wipe it off so there's not too much mineral spirits on it, and then get back into it. doesn't quite match what we originally had for green, but I think that's should be fine. I think it's close enough that it's still within that like color variation, and it just adds a little bit of movement to this color, so it's not all the same, not super solid. And all that's here, that can setting it up to solid, but up against this line. I think I like this one more yellow. All right, we made some progress on the shirt. Let's get back into our skin tones. And I think next time we revisit the shirt, we're going to try and put some highlights in there, because right now it's looking pretty samey throughout. So I think our skin tone is pretty warm right now. So let's see if we can add a little bit of black, not black, but umber, to kind of darken things, but also cool things down a little bit, because red umber, as neutral as it is, it's not super warm. Let's see, this might be even a little too cool, but let's try it. I think we'll separate this into two colors. I think I like the temperature of it, how cool it is, but we can get a darker version and then also a lighter version. So let's get a little darker with more brick umber. Add some more here. We'll mix that. And then we'll also try using brick umber as is straight out too, to see what that can do for us as we're adding our darker tones into painting. So even that, a lot darker than a lot of the things that we have on here. It's like the actual skin and the middle tones. So add some in those, thinking about what that surface is. Bridge, I think that's probably the shadow of my glasses right there. Kind of creating that darker value. Let's add some shading above the eyes. Not super dramatic, but definitely needed. Cooler going into the cheek. Forehead. Set to the chin, bottom of the nose. This part of the chin. And then let's see what this lighter that can do for us. I think we can go even lighter and use this to do the kind of reflected light that's like bouncing off of my skin in the image. So that's one thing you can think of as well in terms of the lighting. How the lighting plays with the skin tone in your portrait. And what are good ways to bring that out through your color choices? And it doesn't always have to be dramatic, but I think you'd be surprised how dramatic it can be. So make sure you're looking pretty closely and really thinking about what is going on in the image. I feel like that would need to be more of a highlight. So we'll probably go back over that later. Right now, we're going to stick to this cool color, which I think is working well. Let's add a curve here to kind of help emphasize the cheek. We can use the brush strokes to help out in pushing the shape that we are painting. And then right here is pretty bright. The side of my head catches a lot of light. So we're going to add that there. And then this part of the bridge of my nose, it's under glasses in the reference, so it's hard to see, but that's a detail that I think will go a long way. So this under eyelid. Yeah, a little clearer. And then we'll do the same under the other eye. And then we'll go a little bit back and forth on that eye, kind of fighting us. So I think this lighter, cooler brown was a good idea. We are just working that in and trying to hit as many spots as we can with it before we swap to something maybe a little different. All right, since we already have this, let's try and get that highlight that we were talking about, especially on the nose and probably the forehead as well. So we can use the same color, go even whiter, and I think we'll add some yellow in there as well to warm things up. Let's try it. We'll lay it down and we'll see. I think it's okay. I think it's workable. And start with that. Ease that in. Engage. This part out a little lighter. Go push and pull. And then sweep fist on my nose. A little stronger. And work that up. Painted shadow. I think it's a little brighter on the cheek as well, but we don't need it to be that bright. So we can put a little bit of powdered orange in there. Kind of going all over to try and find the best places for this highlight color, or I guess this yellower color. It's not necessarily always highlight. I'll say. I feel like we've done a lot in like the upper to mid values. Let's see if we can rein something in with the burnt umber as our darker value. But maybe we need to mix burnt umber with burnt sienna. But we'll just start with this first and see how that takes. And there's my mustache, which I actually no longer have. Long term it. Let's add some shadows here. And the skin is folding in on itself. And then it's maybe a little bit blocky, but we can go back and carve that shape out for a those math muscles. Let's see. I think burnt umber might be a little too warm. I think it's blending in with our skin tones too much. So let's take this. We'll separate it off into this area. We'll add some black. Actually, let's add some blue. I think this is the Prussian blue or the cobalt blue. The ultramarine, actually. We're going to add some ultramarine. Ultramarine and burnt umber get like a really rich, dark shade that's pretty close to black, but not quite. So it's a little bit more interesting most of the time. And I think this will be a good tool, really pushing those dark values really, really quickly. Then we can work back up if we need to. Yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit more successful, a little bit more to the point. What we're looking for from these colors. And it's funny, this image actually looks a little bit different than the first time I painted it, but I think it might be a little bit more accurate. Before, already, it's washing my head. All right. I think I'm confident enough in this darker color to give the eye a shot. So I'm just gonna do a little bit for the eye, and then we'll go back and add the letter values a little later. Get a little bit more notes, and then we'll start dark, and then we will build back up those middle values in a little bit, just so the eye is not too carved out, but we still want it there. So we've got the nose, I think, in a good place. This is a contact point with the glasses. The shadow comes up, so we can do that. Skills. We'll have to add shading with the eye. I feel like a lot of painting is surprisingly similar to sculpting, where you're thinking very much about the form of whatever it is you're painting and trying to use the lightness and darkness of your paints to push and pull into those shapes and forms that you're thinking about, kind of like how you would push and pull into a physical sculpture. What chin is that? All right, let's bring some of those down to the hair, because that is realistically the darkest part of cover painting. So while we have this paint mixed, and then if we ever end up mixing a darker paint, we go to that, add that to the hair. And I'm thinking about the texture of my hair as well. I think if you're painting lighter hair in your self-portrait, you can also think of the hair the same way that you think of skin, in terms of like separating out the dark, middle, and light values and building up the very specific areas that are there. It may not always make sense at first, but it'll definitely come together as you're painting. As those pieces kind of like find themselves and interlock, they'll start to make more and more sense. All right, I'm feeling good about that. Let's do a little bit on the eyebrows. All right, thanks. Gives them big shape for these. Maybe cover a little bit more on this. I'm feeling good about it. So let's add some yellow and then some white. Yellow's got a little bit of green in it. Hopefully it's not too much of an issue. Let's look at a D70. Let's see. It's pretty bright, so we can darken that up. Let's do some burnt sienna to bring back some of those orangey, brownish values, but hopefully not get too close to where we were just at. So maybe a little tweakings. Hit base. And missed a little bit, I think. So we need it, and if we need more, we'll borrow from the color, we use some highlights. Let's try it. I don't think that's too bad. But definitely sculpt on the shape, even if it's not exactly where we want the values, probably. It's a good point to be at, I think. Careful for the edge of the nose here. Okay. I'm sure I like what that did, so let's see if we can want that back. Sure. I feel like I'm going back to this, so let's see. We can mix that with something to get it seeable some more. Yeah. Like this color, and I feel like we haven't used it. Let's see, cuts something darker, warmer color, which might help in sculpting the image out a little bit. You know, like there's a lot of finding different colors, and that's why you can't really be afraid of different color combinations that you haven't tried before. You never know which one is going to be just the one that you need to really tie things together. All right, let's see if we can situate something for the eyes and teeth. I think it's always good to look at colors that are maybe a little bit off-white, because very rarely are the whites of our eyes actually white. They're, taking in shadow from the eyelids. They're reflecting light from whatever the scene is as well. So there's a lot of different factors that generally leads them to be an off-white, even if they are pretty bright compared to the rest of the painting. All right, so let's go back to that the color we had. Let's start thinking about the teeth, and we're just gonna put them in there. It's like a single shape because separating them out is not only difficult but can give a really weird effect. I think we can lighten this up even a little bit more. Can give a really weird effect just because when we look at portraits and when we look at people in general, we're generally not paying super specific attention to the teeth, and we see that information as like one chunk of information as opposed to all the teeth separately. I mean, unless you're a dentist, but you can really get away with pretty minimal shapes for the teeth. Let's see what I need. We'll have both working. I'll start looking at around the gums around them. We could probably use this way to bring the lines and just a little bit. Though this might be too blue of a shade. Off to kind of dancing around a little bit here, but I feel like I'm kind of working on things as I notice them. Right now, this is really kind of sticking out to me in a way that I'm not super fond of. Let's see what that is. There we go. It helps to have an upper lip. All right, huge difference. All right, let's try adding some shadows under the eyes just to bring them out a little bit more. And then the top of the eyelid will be reflecting light. So we're going to add a lighter tone. And I think these eyes might be a little uneven. So let's figure out what that is about. I think a darker tone. That's why it is so good to keep your reference up. Water painting is just problem solving. You're like creating your own problems and you have to fix them. You're doing that over and over again for a couple of hours and then you have a painting. Oh, easy. bit of a highlight, keep it warm, differentiate from that colder highlight, add that to that eye. I'll kind of do that on both sides. And then add this the eyelid. I think that shape kind of interrupts the other shape that we had in there, so we'll go back and adjust that. Those highlights I think will go a long way. For pushing the eyes forward and backward in space. You can highlight this a little bit. Bring that out. Yeah, and as we're working through this, it'll just get more and more developed until eventually you won't be able to think of anything else to add. See if we can get this even a little lighter. Okay, we spent a lot of time on this face. I guess makes sense because it's portraits, but let's see if we can maybe refocus on the bigger picture, tighten up this shirt, and then I think we'll be at a point where we can call it a day. We've got our basic shapes. We've got our likeness pretty situated. And now it'll just come down to tightening up the image as much or as little as we want to get the effect that we're looking for. And then also the glasses. We'll do the glasses. That'll be the last thing. All right. So I think face, just a lot more tone variation in here. We've got a lot of different colors that are kind of working off each other, but the shirt a little less so. I think we'll just go in with a light, cooler green to contrast, and really have more clear areas of light and dark. And then we may go over some shadows just one more time. Gonna try out this shade that I mixed from a highlight that was a little more greenish in our skin tone. Let's see how it works here. I don't think it's too bad, but I think it might be a little white for what we're looking for. You can add a little bit more gray, kind of even that back out. Let's see how this is. Yeah, if that makes a little bit more sense for what we're wanting. So let's do this. We've got the light coming from behind. I think it's reflecting off of a wall in this image. So let's add a little bit there. Follow that seam on the shirt. And then just think about the folds. And just be very specific about where we're placing light and dark values on the shirt and trying to stick to the reference, because it is a lot harder to imagine folds and kind of make those up than to actually just see them and have the image do that math for you. All right, you do a little bit more work on the shirt. Let's bring it back up to kinetic. See if we can't finish some things off. See, do dark red Morla. Add some of that crimson. I like that a lot better. Get some umber. Some of that crimson red. Just get really dark this part of the neck. Let's do so posing for the inner ear because it's technically see-through. Well, not see-through, but translucent. So a lot of the light will kind of come through your ear and be filtered out as like a reddish tone. I guess that's like your blood, probably. The blood in your ear. Just a weird little tidbit that goes a long way for painting ears. Probably even. And so, let's see. And bring this highlight out a little bit more. Just because where it is, I think it gives a lot of valuable information. Then maybe place similar toes here. That'll get us to a similar spot. Just to kind of push out around the cheek is in that spot. This forehead. Do a little touch up on the mouth, and then we'll shoot for some glasses. So this part on the forehead is a little cooler, and I think because we used some paints that were pretty thinned out, it's looking really reddish from that underpainting beneath it. So let's see. Take this, threaten it up a little bit. We're going to see if we can get that triangle shape right here. I think that'll do a lot. Let's darken it back up. That your lip kind of pushed out. We get it out on the same side. Make it look like I'm smiling pretty big. Do that just go a little bit. I think we're doing better. My nose. Let's bring this outline up into one shape. That feels like it was a little bit more broken than it needed to be. And we'll do the same on the other side. So we will darken the spot up to really have that eye socket kind of push in. And then we'll bring highlight to it to pull the top of the eyelid out. To get those really fine details in without messing up the work we already did. Maybe just a little bit more. All right, the last thing we're gonna do is we're gonna add the earrings and glasses. I think jewelry is always easiest to add at the end, um, just because it's really small and it's easier to work on top of a lot of stuff than having to work around. Try to do jewelry. We'll add a little bit of blue just to get things cooler in the middle, and we'll just shape for like a pretty neutral gray. Again, that gray. And then the glasses, I think because my glasses are wireframe and they're not reflecting much, that'll be pretty easy. We'll just get one dark tone and be very, very careful about adding that line on top, um, on top of the face. So I've got the bridge. I think that is a good spot to start, in terms of considering that each of these lenses is going to be the same sizes and opposite sides of the face. So we've got this kind of situated, and then this is going to bump up against this nose where the shadow meets here, up to the side of the face, and then come around. So try and do a single confident line, already thinking about where those curves are going to be. And starting here, goes behind the nose, and then it'll come back out around here. So just one smooth line. And then another thing that we're going to do to help it pop is we're going to add some highlights. But first, let's see if we can't get this other lens to match. So it's going to come down here, meet the nose against the bridge right here, and then loop back around, actually before the hair, and I guess the arm of the glasses coming from here. So let's start placing this down, and then go down this way. And then I think we've got our glasses maybe a little bit slightly off from our reference, but here it's going to be more important to be internally consistent and try and get them to be the same size lenses that we already have to the other side of our face. That'll be our goal. All right, I think we might be a little bit off, but these are definitely work. So now we're just going to do highlights, and then we'll do background. Though background is not necessary for a portrait. I definitely did this one with the idea of having a background just to kind of clean it up. If you want to start off with that a little bit more considered, then that's also a good thing to keep in mind for the start of your painting. But I think backgrounds are a little bit easier to do once you're done. And I think it can help you clean up the edges of your painting as well. By introducing the background after the fact, you have the chance to kind of clean up these edges if you're using like a solid color, or really push the background into the painting to emphasize certain edges at the side of the profile. Let's do something up there. Write those curves right here. that consistent. Kind of push this back. And why did that detail brush out? It's pretty fun. All right, and then we'll mix kind of the lighter blue to match the reference photo that we have and use that as a background. And then from there, we can reassess any last minute kind of touch-ups that we need to do. Right, so let's get our big brush. Get some mineral spirits on it. And then just going to go in kind of fast and loose to start off with. And then as we get close to those edges, we'll kind of clean those up. And I like using a pretty thinned out paint to start with for the background, just so that you maintain the effect of having the underpainting come through under whatever color you're painting on top of. Like, for example, this orange I think is going to look really nice under this blue. And then just be mindful that you're not painting on top of what you already have. I'm working around it instead. And just filling up the space. So that's kind of the simplest way to do a background. And of course, you can do different color gradients. See how surrounding your painting with different colors kind of changes the tone or the effect or even the colors themselves. There's a lot of interesting things that you can do with even just a simple solid color background. You can get it like as neat or like as neat as you want or show as many brush strokes as you want. I tend to leave a lot of the brush strokes pretty evident in my background, so I think it looks nice. It's not too loose, but it's like interesting enough. A little bit more interesting to me than having a solid color background, but not distracting from the main painting, which I think is the most important part. So we're kind of getting the best both worlds here. Okay. And now that we've got a majority of this covered, we can start thinking about ways to use this background, this part, our actual figure, and using it to help us redraw the silhouette that we've established. But so here you might want to get a smaller brush. I think while I'm doing the shirt, I'm fine with this large brush because I feel pretty confident and don't need to be too careful. But as we get to the shapes around the face and the hair, I might want to just tighten it up a little bit. I think this gives us a good chance. And it may also be a good time to bring back out your reference so you can see exactly what you're wanting to push and pull and how that gets you closer to the original intention. Let's get in here. The earring is actually see-through, so we could probably add a moment right here. It's like a disc, the see-through section, so the background will pop through in there. That might be a little like worked around it here. And then I think as well, generally, it's fine if the border between the background and the actual figure isn't super clear cut, I think it'd be really interesting to leave that space a little bit more ambiguous, or unfocused, because sometimes if the background is too sharp against your figure, it can feel like the figure would just be cut out. And I tend to not like that effect as much, but I would encourage you to play around. Let's get the hair a little more texture. I think going to go in a little bit bottom of this here, the face, and then of course we've already got all of our colors mixed. We're still on the palette, so if we need to go back and retouch something that we may have accidentally changed in the background or want to undo it, we definitely can. Like, I think I'm going to go add a little bit more to this part of the hair, this part as well, and then we're going to go in, fill this spot just a little bit more, so it feels a little bit more in line. All right, and that takes us to the end of the painting. I feel like with oil painting, there's endless possibilities for developing the details of the painting even further and further as far as you want to take it until you get to hyper realistic. But I think this is a good spot for where I would want the painting to be. I think it's a little different than the other version that we did, but it's still just as successful. And I think the colors are actually more vibrant. And so I'm counting that as a success in my book. And I'm curious to see how y'all's turns out.